the Saturday crime. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, that was not what I meant to say. Yeah, I'm supposed to be taking time off, but you know how it is. Every time I think I'm out, they pull me right back in. It was the scowl heard round the world. The orange man comes one step closer to wearing prison orange. Okay, there's so much crime, just so much crime from the self-proclaimed most law-abiding citizens in America, it's amazing. Now, let's go ahead and deal with the point that I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking about. As politicized as this clearly all is, there's also a certain amount of poetic justice going on. 30 years ago, you had 5 young men in New York, almost all of them black, who had been falsely accused of rape and railroaded into prison by a combination of dirty police tactics and an unscrupulous DA's office filled with anti-black racist ideologues, all backed up by a vicious white media that sensationalized this to make criminals out of just a bunch of kids. Donald Trump himself took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that the death penalty needed to be brought back because of this alleged crime. This for 5 innocent young teenagers. As we all know, the victim in this case was a white woman, and that was the sole reason for all the phony outrage, for the white media sensationalism and obsession with the case. She had been sexually assaulted, severely beaten, but was still alive, and she eventually recovered. But she was white, and the teenagers accused of harming her were black, and that was all that mattered. And Donald Trump wanted the death penalty because crime, meaning black people in general, were running amok and out of control. As we all know, and as many people knew then, those black teenagers hadn't harmed anyone, but they were black. And because these kids had not really had any experience dealing with the police at all, it was actually very easy for the police to be able to manipulate them using all of those cops' psychological tricks. The flames of this white media-generated lynch mob were being fanned by Donald Trump. Now, what nobody talks about is that just a few months after the Central Park jogger case hit the white media, there was another violent attack in New York. This other case also involved a group of teenagers and a lone pedestrian who was violently assaulted. But the white media gave it very little attention. The reason why was because this other case differed from the Central Park jogger case in 2 crucial regards. First, the victim, who was beaten by a roving gang of teenage thugs, was killed in the attack. He wasn't just injured, he was murdered. And secondly, the teenagers who killed this pedestrian were all white. The victim in this case was a black 16-year-old, Yusuf Hawkins. His murderers were a gang of nearly 3 dozen white teenagers, many of them wielding baseball bats and at least one of them carrying a gun. It was that individual who shot and killed that child, Yusuf Hawkins. But this wasn't the only time a white mob of teenagers had murdered a black person in New York City in the 1980s. Before the Yusuf Hawkins murder, or even the Central Park jogger case, you had the murder of Willie Turks in 1982. He was an MTA worker who was savagely beaten by a white mob of teenagers and early 20-somethings. This resulted in his death. Donald Trump, who I'm pretty sure was living in New York City in the early 80s, didn't feel compelled to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times over that murder. He didn't even take out an ad in the classifieds. And there was no white media sensation about this murder either. It was treated as just another violent incident, not worth making a big deal out of. There was also another killing in 1986. This time it was Michael Griffith, a construction worker, picking up his paycheck from a job site when he and a couple of his friends were ambushed by a white mob, many of them teenagers carrying baseball bats. See a pattern forming yet? Donald Trump was in New York City in 1986. Keep in mind, this was just 3 years before the Central Park jogger case. And yet Trump wasn't moved by the heinous murder of Michael Griffith to take out a full-page ad in the paper or even to make a statement. And Trump wasn't alone. The white media, who would be in an uproar about the Central Park jogger case, wasn't too worked up about Michael Griffith's killing at all. Nobody was asking what was behind all these incidents of white youth ambushing and murdering black New Yorkers throughout the 1980s. They totally ignored it. Why? Because in those cases the victims were black, which meant that their deaths were irrelevant. But more importantly, the killers were white, which meant that they shouldn't be punished, certainly not for killing black people. Donald Trump definitely wasn't calling for any punishment in any of those cases. If you watched any white media content from the 1970s, when crap like Death Wish was all the rage, or the 1980s, when New York was going through the worst crime wave, quote-unquote, in its history, Nobody was showing movies or TV shows with roving gangs of white youths beating unarmed black citizens to death. But that's the reality of what was happening in New York City in the 1980s. Racists like Donald Trump never got worked up for a Yusuf Hawkins or a Michael Griffith or any of the black people who had been harmed by these roving white teenage gangs in New York. And neither did his buddy Rudy Giuliani, who insists to this day that even if the Central Park Five weren't guilty of the crime they had been falsely accused of, well, they had to have been guilty of something. Which, by the way, is the catch-all rationalization that black men are always hit with. Whenever a black man is accused of something, even when it's shown that there's no evidence to support the accusation, racists in white society will say, well, the nigger has to be guilty of something. And when the black person goes to trial and proves their innocence, or when a black person is released from prison after having spent years, if not decades, incarcerated for a crime they didn't commit, which everyone knew they hadn't committed from the start, the catch-all excuse from white society is, well, if they didn't do this one, you know they had to have done something else. That is the one-size-fits-all rationalization that always gets dragged out to justify incarcerating black people. Because everyone understands that the crime the black person committed isn't whatever phony accusation is being put against them. Their crime is being black. That's why all these racists say the exact same phrase, because they all know what the real crime is. Doesn't matter if the black person's innocent. Doesn't matter if they know they're innocent. What matters is the black person needs to be put in prison because reasons. So now you have Trump and Giuliani having their mugshots taken. And now you have them as the ones proclaiming their innocence, to largely deaf ears. The white media circus is in full swing about this one. Well, I guess what goes around does come around. And isn't it deliciously ironic how the same white conservatives who constantly lecture black people about how the system isn't perfect, but it's the only one we've got, so you have to have faith in it, even if it lets you down. The people who have always told black Americans that the police don't target black citizens and prosecutors aren't targeting black people either, they're not defending the system now. In fact, they're railing against it. None of the lies and thinly veiled insults that they throw at us when we point out how prosecutors target us are sufficient now. No lectures about believe in the system even when it lets you down. Yeah, these indictments have been like truth serum for these racists, and no, I don't feel sorry for these scumbags. When Giuliani was mayor of New York, he made the amazingly corrupt Bernard Kerik his police commissioner. Bernard Kerik also has the distinction of being the first New York City police commissioner to ever go to prison. Well, I guess jailbirds of a feather flock together. This was who Giuliani was running buddies with back in the day. You have the so-called champions of law and order, who have been the main ones committing the crimes and hanging out with felons because this is the criminal class in America. Now, let's also talk about something else. Fani Willis. She didn't bring these indictments to do black folks any favors. She's been sitting on this for 3 years now and wasn't really doing anything about it. You can lie to yourself about that if you want, but you're a fool if you actually think she was going to bring this case on her own. It was only after the feds announced that they were bringing their case against Trump, not to mention the Manhattan DA, that she suddenly decided that she could bring hers. Truth be told, she actually had the most evidence of wrongdoing by Trump, and if there was anybody who had the strongest case, it was her, but she didn't want to bring one because she's desperately hoping that she can run for higher office, and she doesn't want to offend any of those good old boy donors down there who she's going to be begging for campaign cash later on. Fani Willis is like Barack Obama in that these white supremacists don't care about how harmless she's been to them or how many of their boots she's been licking. All they see is a black woman having their hero Trump and his pals forced to appear for court and then putting out mugshots of them. I get a kick, though, out of watching the white right kvetch and shriek and whine like babies about this. Seeing trash like Trump and Giuliani made to pose for mugshots is heartwarming, I admit. But I'm not going to make a saint out of a sinner either. I'm not naive or foolish enough to think that Fani Willis did this for black people, or that she's thinking about anything other than how this can benefit her with the DNC later down the line. All right, now let's get to the part that isn't being talked about. The reasons the Democrats are bringing this raft of charges against Trump is partially justifiable. That's just a fact. But it's also partly politics. That's a fact, too. The January 6th insurrection was undoubtedly an incident that required heads to roll. If a mob of white supremacist trash can storm the Capitol, force the government officials to flee for their lives, and people don't go to prison for it, even high-ranking individuals, then it would be an invitation for more incidents just like it, or worse ones to take place. After the insurrection, people were bracing for all hell to break loose from the Justice Department, but it didn't, not under Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr or under his successor Merrick Garland. Instead, we saw that white privilege was enough to insulate someone from being punished, even for trying to overthrow the U.S. government. But then again, why not? After the Civil War, the entire Confederate leadership was allowed to go scot-free and live their lives. Robert Lee was the military commander of the Confederacy, and not only did he not go to prison, he was allowed to go and become a professor at Princeton University. I'm not making that up. Robert Lee was allowed to live out his days in comfort. Jefferson Davis was the first and last president of the Confederacy. He was the man who led the largest act of mass treason in U.S. history. But he only did a brief bit in prison and then was allowed to go right back to Virginia, where he resumed invoking the exact same extremist rhetoric as he had before the war. So white privilege is more than enough to keep people from being punished for most anything. But there is also the political dimension to all of this. Donald Trump scared the Republican establishment with how easily he got their own base to turn against them. Yes, he claimed to be one of theirs, and he helped to get some of their guys into political office, but the GOP leaders will never forget that their introduction to Trump was being insulted by him, made into targets for his rabid base, and that when the GOP politicians tried to get their own voters who had followed and voted for them for decades, to ignore Trump, instead their own voters ignored them. A lot of the GOP brass, like Mitch McConnell, were able to make use of Trump, like for capturing a large number of federal judgeships, but they never liked him. When someone comes into your house, a house that you've ruled without rival or question for decades, a house where everyone bows and scrapes to you and you alone, when some outsider pops in out of nowhere and takes those same masses who supported you and gets them to turn against you, you're not going to appreciate that. Even if they do you a couple of favors here and there, even if he agrees to give you some things that you want, even important things, at the end of the day, he's still an interloper. The GOP establishment expected that at some point, Trump would show some sort of deference and respect for the positions that they've held for so long, that he would show them that he understood that he had to take orders from them at some point. But if there's one thing Trump has shown, it's that once he gets his hands on power, he doesn't believe in sharing it. Trump had the GOP base wrapped around his finger, and he had no problem showing the GOP leadership that he could weaponize their voters against them. If you're having a dinner party with your best friends, people you've known all your life, people who suck up to you like crazy, what would you do if some lout barged in uninvited, walked up in your house, put their feet up on your furniture, and then began calling you a loser in what you thought was your house? And when you look at your party guests, instead of them being offended by the disrespect that you're being shown, instead of them demanding that this interloper get out, because after all, they've known you for decades and they've known this guy for 5 minutes, what would you do if your own party guests, your friends, began to applaud this interloper who was calling you a loser and saying that he's right and telling you that they're not going to come to your house anymore unless this guy is there too? Even if this interloper occasionally does your bidding, you're going to resent him. Politicians are hideously insecure. That Donald Trump was able to swat the GOP aside so easily, that's something that they can't forget or forgive, because power is easily lost in a town like D.C. You're only as powerful as people think you are. Donald Trump managed to diminish the GOP base in the eyes of their own voters, to show them as being so weak that without him their own base would have no reason to go to the polls. So make no mistake, there's a contingent of GOP leaders who are glad that this is happening. If the Democrats do manage to take Trump down, that solves a problem for the Republicans, because then Trump's base are not going to attack Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy for that. Sure, their voters will be mad, but the white right gets mad about everything. They claimed that they would stop watching Fox News after Bill O'Reilly got the boot, but of course they kept on watching. Tucker Carlson, he got Bill O'Reilly's old time slot, and they loved him too, up until he got the boot and the same white right said this time they really mean it, they're going to stop watching Fox News. But of course they didn't. Sure, there was a predictable dip in ratings after Carlson left, but those numbers have already started to rebound. Like I said, the racist white right are like pigs at the trough. They'll gobble up the slop no matter who serves it up. For all of the legal complexity and even poetic justice, at its base, this is just another political football in the game of power politics. But there's something else that I've noticed that I think needs to be said. Call it my black intuition, but the vibes these white people on these cable news stations are throwing off is that a lot of them are not pleased that Fani Willis chose to make Trump take a mugshot. Yes, there's the orange man bad contingent, and of course the never Trumpers. But there's also a lot of these folks on these white cable networks who seem to be more than a little miffed about what Fani Willis is doing, or at least how she's going about it. You know, it reminds me of how they reacted when Kamala Harris was low-key implying that Biden was racist during the 2020 primary debates, back when she dinged him about his position on school busing back in the day. The white media and the white voters on the left didn't like that. As they saw it, she didn't have enough rank, racially speaking, to call down a white man like she was doing. And they showed her that at the polls. I'm catching similar vibes from a lot of these white media and commentary types about Fani Willis making Trump take a mugshot, and her decision to ask the judge to start Trump's trial for March 4th, which will be Super Tuesday. That's what you call an unforced error. If you want to underscore that this is totally and completely about nothing more than hurting Trump politically, this is how you do it. Talk about trying to be too clever by half. Fani Willis is trying to appeal to a white leftist audience. I guess she's doing her own version of, hey, if the Republicans can do some dirty tricks with their positions, watch what I can do. Problem is, Fani Willis is a community college level lawyer. She doesn't have the skill or the intelligence to run the tables against Trump. If her cases fall apart, if the other co-defendants decide not to flip on Trump, if this goes the same way that the Mueller investigation did, where practically nobody was willing to turn against Trump, and if she winds up getting some of the smaller fish but simply can't land the big one, then the same white media who's acting so elated with her right now, they're going to also turn on her. Sure, they love the feast that she's provided for them. They're getting views and clicks out of it, but ultimately they can get mileage out of talking about the fall of Fani Willis too if this doesn't pan out. So the great game continues regardless. And speaking of games, when talking about the 2024 election, the white media and their online minions are all saying that the big thing hurting the Republicans is abortion, LGBT rights, anti-trans legislation. They have been going out of their way to say abortion and LGBT rights when it comes to talking about factors that the 2024 election hinges on. This is their narrative. And you can pretty much tell this came from DNC headquarters. The Democrats are making it excruciatingly clear that they want to cater to white suburban women, and when they talk about LGBT issues, they claim that that appeals to young voters. So those are the buttons that they're trying to push. Since the bottom fell out of the Democrats' black support after the Obama betrayal, the Democrats have been furiously trying to stitch together a new voter coalition to make up for the solid black support that they've lost. They've tried to put a pretty face on it, but senior Democratic strategist James Carville let the mask slip when he was on Ari Melber's show and admitted that black votership was actually down in 2022, and Democrats better be worried for what this means in 2024. He's right. The only reason Biden is president is because all those black constituents who stayed home in 2016, I'm talking about Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, they showed up in 2020. Without that black support, Biden wouldn't have won the presidency, and the Democrats wouldn't have gotten control of both houses of Congress. Black voters single-handedly gave them control of the U.S. government. And what did Democrats do to reward black voters for giving them this gift? They did nothing. Oh, they gave everybody else legislation and tangibles specifically for them. So when they try to give you that democracy hangs in the balance crap again, tell them to bounce. If the stakes are really so high, if America stands on the precipice of being a fascist state, if the danger is really so great as they say, then it ought to be easy for them to give us what we're owed. God knows they haven't given us anything else. But not only are they refusing to pay the reparations they owe, but they also flat out refuse to do the very empty proposals that they made in 2020, like Biden's pathetic so-called White House Police Accountability Commission, or their stupid lift all boats nonsense. Obviously, neither one of those so-called proposals would have done anything significant for black people, but the Democrats are so dedicated to the principle of doing absolutely nothing for black people under any circumstances that even those two empty gestures were too much. They are psychopathically driven to make sure black people don't get anything, even if it means Democrats lose office and become a permanent political minority. Some people on the right have said the Democrats are obsessed with nailing Trump. No, they're preoccupied with Trump, but what they're obsessed with is making sure that black people get nothing. That's the Democrats' obsession, and it's also the Republicans' obsession too. Both parties are determined to die on this hill. So I say, let them. Democrats are trying to thread a particularly thin needle. They're pivoting hard to those non-black constituencies that they're hoping to gather. They're making it clear they're not talking about black people unless they feel they have no other choice, and even then it's going to be just in passing. The Democrats want white women and LGBT people to feel that they're special in the eyes of the white Democratic leadership. And, unlike with black people, Democrats have no problem delivering things for white women or the LGBT community, at least the white portion of it. So that's why all the Democrats talk is about abortion and trans rights, because as they see it, that's going to be their new Democratic base, one that is meant to make the black constituents, which have apparently become a little bit too uppity, irrelevant. At least that's what they hope. So those are my thoughts about the Trump administration's family photo. Yes, it's great to see a number of these racist reprobates getting a taste of their own medicine. It's good, and it's long overdue, and they deserve it. That's not the problem. The problem is that after the sugar rush of seeing these scumbags humiliated inevitably wears off, what do we have to show for it? How have we benefited from it? If it's just about seeing them made to walk in the shoes of black people that they've persecuted, that's fine. I'm there for it. But the Democrats don't give a damn about that. The only time they ever mention black people is when they want to try to hide behind our history and our suffering, much of which they inflicted on us, so that they can do things for other people. To them, our purpose is to be used as rhetorical shields, and they'll give us a pat on the head and say, "Thank you. Oh, you're so righteous, aren't you?" Well, it's a brand new day. And there's more and more black people who are finally learning that we have to demand better than that. And that means not being distracted. When they try to dangle a Trump prosecution in front of us, our answer is supposed to be, that's nice, but a Trump conviction is no substitute for the money you owe us. The white media is doing the most to make a circus out of Donald Trump's arrest and his mugshot. They want people to be obsessed about it, especially black people. Oh, shouldn't you be fixated on this? This is a historical moment, don't you know? Well, the only photo that we're interested in is the picture of the check we're owed. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Sandra Bates, Kevin Buckner, Black Mama, Gwendolyn Langston, and Brian Anderson. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.